All right. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where everyone's watching us from. I'm Neil Morton. I'm a Western education reporter for the Hechinger Report and want to start today's panel with a big thank you for the TREP project for inviting me to moderate this panel on practices for educating students coping with a high cognitive stress load. Um, Thanks to each of you, however many hundred folks we have joining us for this panel, which includes four impressive experts on ways to help students manage high levels of stress and anxiety. It's a topic that seems particularly important as our nation and especially communities of color careen between this global pandemic, economic uncertainty, and systematic racism. Before I introduce our panelists, let me take a moment just to plug my outlet, the Hechinger Report. We're a national newsroom that covers inequality and innovation in education. I actually joined Hechinger on March 16th, the same day that schools shuttered across the country and threw the lives of millions of students and families into chaos. My initial stories for Hechinger have focused on how the digital divide, staggeringly high student to counselor ratios, and the nation's growing homelessness crisis have made this moment even more traumatic for youth already trying to survive on the margins. And for some framing for this panel, I wanted to highlight the fact that we know in the most recent youth risk behavior survey from the CDC, at least 17% of high schoolers in the US reported that they had seriously considered attempting suicide, and another 14% reported making a suicide plan in the last year, and nearly a third of high school students reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. And that was all before social distancing, 40 million plus people filed for unemployment, and the deaths from COVID-19 keep on ticking up. And already we know that early research has linked, at least in Wuhan, China, just a month of school closures to increase in students reporting symptoms of depression and anxiety. The ACLU, in a similar survey based in California, found that before the pandemic, less than 10% of students reported their mental wellness on a scale of 1 to 3 on a 10-point scale. Since then, that's more than doubled to nearly a quarter of all students ranking their mental health fairly low. Thankfully, we have four experts here to help us figure out how to help students navigate all this sudden change and uncertainty while keeping them focused on learning. First, we have Judy Willis. She spent 15 years as a practicing neurologist before taking those skills to a second grade classroom and also teaching middle school algebra in California. Now at the UC Santa Barbara Graduate School of Education, she teaches teachers how to tap into brain research to create more welcoming and safe classrooms for all students. We also have the pleasure of learning today from Lori DeSoutles, an assistant professor at Butler University's College of Education, where she created a graduate certificate program there to help educators and counselors who work with youth experiencing adversity and trauma. She previously founded the Educational Neurosciences Symposium at Marian University in Indiana. Next, please meet Lindsay Richland. She's an associate professor at UC Irvine School of Education. She focuses her research on the ways children develop complex reasoning skills, both in and out of schools, and higher order thinking and executive functioning. She works with the University of Science of Learning Lab and recently shifted some of her work to how pressure and anxiety exacerbate opportunity gaps. And then finally, as our TREP project representative on this panel, we have Stacy Williams. She's one of the project school coaches, but before joining TREP, she worked as an interventionist, classroom teacher, school administrator, district leader, and instructional coach, among other titles. She now works with educators in schools to address challenges such as racial disproportionality in special education, exclusionary discipline, and college access. Thanks to each of the panelists for offering their time and expertise today. I'd like to start, if I can, please, with Judy, who hopefully can set a foundation of how brain science explains stress's role in learning and memory, and how the brain can bounce back from what's going on today. Thank you, Judy. And if you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Nia, for that excellent introduction. And I feel before, it's been a few hours, people have been involved. I really, as a neurologist, need to make sure your stress level is okay. So I want you, with the next slide, to progress to the next. Okay, here's what I want you to do, because there's a study on stress showed that when subjects were shown a picture of two identical dolphins, those suffering from chronic stress, the worse that it was, the more differences they saw between these two identical dolphins. So on the next slide, I want you to look at the photo. And do you see any differences? Oh, you do? Okay, we're starting with stress that's in, back 2 slides, please. Stress is clearly prevalent in administrators, teachers, parents. It's a high stress state because I only saw the two dolphins, but then again, I made the slide, no. So with that, it's to reinforce my sincere dedication and passion that we've experienced today, I'd like to take my MD neurology part, give you a bit of information from there about what's happening in the brain from stress, how learning situations can modify that, and then specific strategies for interventions. Certainly not all of them, but I believe my website is on this page. So on that, you can link to me with questions or many of my articles. But let's just start right off. We decided that you're kind of stressed. Well, I think that's the reason that I left neurology, stopped my neurology practice, which was doing great, and went into teaching and then taught, and now I'm here. The problem I saw was more and more kids were being referred to me by their teachers through their parents because they were showing zoning out or acting out or underachieving or scattered. And it was sort of level for the first 12 years of my practice, and then it really accelerated, and there was no increase in the actual number of patients, these kids that I would diagnose with these problems. But why were they all being diagnosed or assumed to have Tourette's or petit mal epilepsy or dysfunctional behavior disorders, et cetera? So I started observing in the schools, and I talked to their teachers, and it was standardization of the curriculum even before the standardization of the tests. So as I watched the kids in the classroom, I saw their faces, and I saw where they were sitting. They were not in their groups anymore. They were not working on projects. There was no glitter on the floor. The kids were sort of sitting in rows, even little ones, and they were doing rote listening or acting. So applying what I knew from neuroscience to teaching, I didn't feel gave me the right to start teaching. So I went to school, got a credential, and started teaching for 10 years. And the things that I've applied that I now offer you to understand stress with learning and to intervene are what I'll be suggesting. So here's the science. I wanted to know, I wanted to be able to share when I became a teacher, what's happening in the brain during stress? Is there a stress button? Is it like pushing it? Well, kind of. And there's a place deep in the brain in the emotional system called the amygdala. And that's a switching station. When information is coming in from what people hear and see and are taught, it has to get through this amygdala to reach the prefrontal cortex, to reach the memory construction. In addition, if the amygdala is like blocked, their executive functions, their ability to self-manage, calm, reflect before reacting, that can't send messages to manage the behavior from their lower brain survival. So with that information, it was important to know what is blocking the flow through the amygdala. So animals are reaching fight, flight, freeze when they get stress and threat. And that's their amygdala. When they perceive stress or threat, animals in the wild, they switch to the lower brain, fight, flight, freeze. And that's what learners are doing when stressors build in their amygdala and block flow up and down. Interventions, many of them besides ones we've heard today, incredible ones, climate, mindfulness. I work with the Han Foundation about mindset, so that's important, but also teachers understanding and the students understanding the neuroscience of this switching station, that if it goes into the red zone because of increased stress, increased threat, and as I'll end with, education teaching that is not in their Goldilocks zone, that's going to put it in the red zone. If their amygdala hits red, their behavior is going to be involuntary, not their choice. So they shouldn't be given these names or they can be given, they've heard them. These names that they have a bad brain. No, their brain is reacting when it's at the stress level. So we improve the stress level. We can't change everything in the world, but we really can, in the learning situation, put them in their Goldilocks zone where they're not bombarded by, I can't do that, or the boredom of teaching everybody with the same instruction for the same test. So the amygdala in humans, when it gets high because of stress, threat, or profoundly by sustained boredom and irrelevance and frustration that they can't achieve the goal. In humans, when that happens, until they're older, it's hard to send a message down to chill it. So they indeed will fall further behind in the stress state. So what we can do to improve the flow, explain to them about how the brain hits that stage, and then it's not their fault, but let's build the skills that will keep the upper brain recognizing the stress state in the low brain and send down the controls before it's too late. When kids are empowered with that and they realize they have neuroplasticity, which you'll find on the links and everyone's other resources, but the power that their brain is limitless to change. So even after this big gap, they didn't have access to technology and still don't, their brain is limitless and in profound responsive phase during the school years. And they can get the wisdom and the skills that they want with our help.
Great, thank you, Judy. And to pick up on that line of neuroscience, we'll turn next to Lori, who can share some of her understanding of the importance of creating a sense of safety and belonging for students, and how it's important to calm children. Please, Lori, take it away.
Thank you, Neil, so much. And thank you, Judy, for that wonderful introduction. And I just wanted to share a couple of things. Judy has been my mentor for the past several years, and it's more than an honor to sit beside her on this panel today. I love you, Judy, so thank you. I want to begin today by sharing with everyone that even though I am at Butler University and I am teaching graduate and undergraduate courses, Butler has given me a course release, and I've had that for the past 6 years, and I will continue this year. I'm back in the classroom. And so along with teaching my undergraduate and graduate students, I've been working every semester, a morning and an afternoon or 2 mornings a week, implementing these practices and strategies for regulation and for connection that I'm going to be talking about in the next couple of minutes. So if we could go to the next slide, that would be wonderful. What I'm going to be speaking about briefly today, we are encountering 2 significant viruses right now, globally and nationally. We have this COVID pandemic, and we also have this racism that has come up close and personal. These are traumas. We're seeing collective trauma, institutional trauma, generational trauma, individual trauma, and it's hitting all of us hard. It's going to hit our educators. It has hit in our families. It is about all of us. So when we look at this framework today, when we think about the application of this science, there are 4 legs to this. The very first leg I want to mention today is my brain and body state. If I had known these strategies and practices as a mom, I would have been a different parent. I would have been a very different teacher. I understand that emotions are contagious. And I know that when those lower brain regions that Judy just talked about are disorganized, and they are not integrated, we cannot access this prefrontal cortex. This is where we do life. This is where we do school. This is where we make decisions. We're creative. We have the ability to pause. And when our kids walk in carrying in pain, they are unable to access that. But it begins with me. Discipline, behavior management is about me. The second leg of this is the core of this new discipline protocol, We've got to change the way we discipline, because so many of our Black and brown children are being over-identified and disproportionately punished. And it leads from the school to the prison pipeline. Co-regulation is my responsibility. I share my calm with a child. The third leg of this is attachment. And we know that attachment develops the brain. Attachment is the carrier of brain development and the nervous system development. So what we can begin to do in schools is to amp up our touch points, to create those moments. It's natural. It happens in our procedures, our routines, the way that we interact with students, a smile, a gesture, the way we posture. And the fourth leg of this, and Judy talked about this, teaching our kids about their brains. When you understand what's happening inside your brain and body, you begin to feel empowered, and then you feel relieved. You know that you're not a bad kid. You know that you have not done anything wrong. This is not a disorder. This is a reordering of neural networks in the brain. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I want to begin with something that is critical for this work. These practices and procedures are built into what we already do. And I want to talk about sensations today. I want to talk about sensory language, because many of our students and adults, we don't have a good feeling vocabulary. We can talk about feelings, but we really can't just hone in on how we're experiencing trauma. Trauma is a nervous system physiological development. It is not just about the brain. It's about how implicit embodied memory lands into our bodies and brain, and it's held there subconsciously. So we have several practices and strategies that we're implementing, but with 5 minutes today, I'm going to share with you my favorite. This is a touch point. This is co-regulation. And this is, as Dan Siegel says, naming what you contain. This is called the sensation word wall. And I want to share today that there are 3 conditions that the brain struggles with in trauma. And the very first one, and that we are seeing right now, is chronic unpredictability. The second one is isolation. And the third condition that the brain cannot take is emotional and physical restraint. It locks us into these lower brain regions. So when you can draw, when you can color, when you can share that you're edgy, that you are sweaty, that you feel hot, that you feel rough, when you can draw that, when you can journal it, when you can share it, it is calming to the nervous system. This research is coming from from Linda Chapman, and she has wonderful research on how art, movement, and breath, and all of the regulatory practices that we need even before we start making and really creating relationships. Yes, relationships are critical, but we've got to hit those lower brain regions first, because this is where the brain begins to develop, and this is where trauma and adversity literally lock us up. And we have those sensations that sometimes keep us in that fight, flight, or dissociative modes. So I hope I did not go over. So anyway, thank you, Neil. Thank you.
No, thank you, Lori. I think on a personal basis, I'm learning quite a bit of how to get through these very chronic uncertainty, as you put it. Next, if we can go to Lindsay, who also has some very practical tips for educators on reducing stress for students, especially in this unusual time. Lindsay, please. If you can unmute yourself.
Sorry, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be part of this day. Really just amazing talks this morning, and to be part of this panel. So really thank you. I'm learning so much. So what I would like to talk about a little bit, maybe we can go to the next slide, and I think these slides have a lot in there, but what I do, a lot of my work really looks at how children's conscious processing is really, this sort of, prefrontal cortex, basically how our common resources are engaged in many of the core work that we're doing in classroom contexts. So I don't know if we can advance the slide. There we go. So here we have our little brain, and my work in schools, I really focus a lot on higher order thinking, right? So if we think hard about what we think of as one of the core missions of our schools, David Adams said this morning, my educational goals are to have my kids leave school able to solve problems and contribute to their society. And I think these are really great sort of core goals. So I think a lot about how to make sure that kids are doing high order thinking in schools. Now, those are cognitively taxing, right? We have to be, really going beyond information that's in front of us. So teaching kids to be critical thinkers, go beyond the information on that website, how to be critical and thoughtful about that, how to put together an argument that has, reasoned arguments and evidence behind it so that people will listen to you. These are really important skills that we want our kids to have. How to pick up patterns for the environment, learn quickly. These are going to be crucial in the employment context that kids are going to encounter when they leave school, where you have to learn a new technology system. This is something that we're grappling with right now with distance learning. So these are crucial skills. Now, they are involved, the same resources that we put towards conscious processing of stress and worries. So when, those of you sitting and listening to a full day's worth of talks are probably, noticing your mind is wandering to think about what's maybe happening on your street or in your family and, in our national context right now. It's effortful, to think about the sort of stress and these, many aspects of our environment that are going on. So these are the same resources, right? We're kind of moving between them. The same resources are involved in the more mundane aspects of our school assignments. So things like, where do I find the homework? What day is it due? What exactly do I have to do for that assignment? Those are actually quite taxing on kids. And things like monitoring social relationships. These same resources are involved in monitoring, those pieces Lori was talking about, paying attention to the gestures and the smile. And, we are really attuned to that. I have a middle and high school students might not show you that they really care about how teachers are connecting with them, but they're attending to those, right? They really, these kinds of social relationships are crucial and really powerful. And again, take attention. Those same resources are involved in inhibiting our impulses and ignoring distraction. So this is a lot of work, right, on the same system. And it's a limited resource set. And so we want to think hard about how children's attention is being allocated, how their resources are being taxed, and thus, and it's all important work. I think that's the other thing to think about. These are all important things that our brains and our minds are doing. None of them are, not necessary. And none of them should be undervalued. So thinking about these resources can help us maybe get some traction on understanding how do we help students build their learning and learn what we want them to get out of school. So for me, in part, it's about thinking about how do we build out, opportunities for learning without forgetting about something like higher order thinking. But also, I don't want to devalue the crucial nature of building your strategies for handling stress, coping, and building social strength, all of the rest of these aspects. So I've listed here some practical pieces that are a jumping off point. You all know your social context better, your particular school context better, but some ideas are, first of all, to make this conscious, make this explicit and a topic for discussion. So helping kids understand why they might feel distracted or impulsive, why they might miss deadlines or underperform on a test. You don't want kids to walk away with, well, I'm just not smart. I'm just not good at that. These are really understandable, right? Their brains are active, and sort of building on that, fostering this growth mindset. A lot of you, probably educators, are thinking about this in schools. It's something we've been talking about for a while, but understanding that the brain grows the harder it works means that we want to think about coping with stress as hard work and powerful work. And struggle is good because it means that we're getting stronger and we're building these resources. Building resilience is going to be, crucial and powerful and important for kids throughout their lifespan. So praising effort in all its forms. So thinking about these as positives, right? these are really strengths that these kids are building. Thinking about what sorts of tools we can use to minimize uncertainty. Uncertainty causes more stress. So classroom routines, it's another thing we've known have been important, but really, emphasizing the things that if we can always, keep a lot of these routines there, we can minimize the effort that students are putting in these, these crucial resources, minimize the effort that they have to use to attend to things like deadlines, platforms, assignments, helping with mind-wandering reminders, giving them kind of that clue to remember to, come into themselves and come back to what they're working on. Many times they really want to be doing it, right? But they're, this is effortful to maintain attention and distraction. Things like planners or automated calendars can be important. And helping students recognize that stress responses are, again, important and powerful opportunities. They can help us excel. We want to use them. Suppressing emotions doesn't work, suppressing stress responses, but rather thinking about, are there ways that this can be actually powerful? Having us be quite, responsive is something that can be harnessed in learning, right? So thinking about how to, really use stress responses in powerful ways. So thinking things like mindfulness, deep breathing, expressive writing can be kind of tools that require, work and training, but they're not resource intensive. And maybe we can go to the next slide quickly. And again, I won't go through all of these in detail, but really the broad idea being to help students focus where it counts, thinking hard about what the crucial educational mission is. And that might be social and emotional learning, that might be building these coping strengths, it might be creating opportunities to build higher order thinking skills, and thinking about how to really make sure that kids are being able to allocate their resources and attention to that, as opposed to, some of these more irrelevant kinds of things that are just, kind of part of the landscape of being in schools rather than being really part of the educational mission. And I'll just highlight the last one, which is, to the extent possible, reduce mental work monitoring social dynamics. Make it easy for students to see that you care. Same for educators. Make it clear to teachers that administrators care. People are always doing a lot of work and expending effort on that monitoring process, but building those caring relationships can really pay dividends to, kind of allow, people to focus in the ways that really are important. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. And good to end on that slide of how to help students focus, since that's something that our final panelist, Stacy, will talk about strategies on helping students with their memory and retention and removing barriers to focus and attention. Please take it away.
All right. I want to start with just thanking everyone. This is an honor to be on this panel with you all as the TRET project, we're a research to practice project. And so all of you experts, even on this panel, we've referred to your work as we have encouraged educators here in Chicago, Ohio, and around the nation to really take the science to practical application in the classroom. So thank you so much for the work you're doing. We are so excited with the TRET project for this conference and the response and this opportunity to move this conversation forward. I think one of the things that I have been feverishly pursuing is how do we accelerate healing? How do we accelerate taking the reality of trauma, but the reality of resilience, which is what all of you are talking about, and how do we accelerate the healing and the growth that is possible for us as educators and our students and their families as well? And so before I get into my slide, I want to just make sure I make a point of this, and that is that trauma is real. It is real. 1 in 3 children in this country have experienced trauma to the level that it will disrupt their learning. 1 in 3 before COVID. And now we are talking about those numbers being even higher. We also talk about compounding factors. where an incident of trauma, it might be the loss of a primary caregiver, is then combined with that child being removed from the home or needing to be provided a different home. And then maybe it's multiple homes. And so now they are experiencing housing instability. And then depending on where they're going, it might be food instability. And so these compounding factors are really at play with COVID-19, where I and all of us with the TREP project are situated in a position to hear stories around the country where children are needing to care for parents who have contracted COVID-19. And that's why they can't show up online to their Zoom class. Or where they've lost their primary caregiver, who actually was their grandmother because they already lost their mother tragically a couple of years ago. And so it's these compounding factors that we need to be shifting, not just our focus on trauma because of the national epidemic prior to COVID-19, but because of the reality of the disproportionate effects that are happening for our communities and across our country, and because the power that schools hold is the power to heal through relationships. What we know, in contrast to those statistics, is that even with the most highest ACEs score, one positive, strong relationship with a caring adult can be enough for a child to be put on the trajectory to healing and growth and to thrive. Just one. And for all of the resources we don't have in schools, that is what we have in abundance, is strong, positive, caring adults who can connect with children. The very thing that we need right now, schools are the ones who have it. And so for us collectively to harness the power of the creative resources and the expertise and the minds in this conference to together figure out how do we center student connectedness and belonging and those positive connections to heal is really exciting. And I'm hoping that that is what one of the many points of inspiration that we can take away from this conference is collectively, how do we make sure that every child within our reach has a connection to a positive adult? And so with that, all of these things that we've talked about from Judy and Lori and Lindsay, we're talking about these are ways that students feel connected to school and that they belong there. And that message of belonging is so critical right now, because as we also know, so many students don't have access to technology. And so how do we make sure that in the digital divide, students are staying connected, but also they're staying connected to learning, wherever that might be, however that might be, because that's what we need to make sure they understand. They belong in education as learners. This is where they belong. And so we need to really emphasize that. Next slide. So I'll touch on this. A lot of people have already talked about it, but I want to highlight something that I really appreciated about the slide from the Center on the Developing Child out of Harvard. And that is that as Lori and Judy were talking about the prefrontal cortex. So you'll see that in the slide in that kind of aqua color. That's the area that we're talking about executive functioning. That's like all of the stuff of learning is held there. So working memory, filtering input, impulse control, planning, organizing, it's all there, but it's also the center of where stress and traumatic exposure can deeply impact. So one of the things to consider that this slide shows is the red serotonin pathway and the blue dopamine pathways. Those pathways are activated by positive social connection. So you can take very practically some intentionality about the power of relationships to heal, and recognize that when we take a trauma responsive instructional design approach, we can think about, as educators in the classroom, how can I bring in social positive engagement that can raise the dopamine levels and raise the serotonin levels of my students, which will help to calm the amygdala response and situate students to be able to activate that prefrontal cortex that they need. And so the way that I talk about it with schools and educators is, how do we prime the brain for learning? And a theme I've heard on from several folks and in the previous session is around consistency and predictability. And in the the TREP project, what we talk about is this: C and P, consistency on the part of educators creates predictability on the part of students that creates safety for everyone. Consistency on the part of educators creates predictability for students that creates safety for everyone, educators and students. So what we talk about in TREP are very practical practices that are good for everyone. They're good for educators, they're good for all students. And what we have done is honed in on the science specifically of the practices that then are extremely helpful in stress and trauma, which 3 months ago was a third of the classroom. Now, and for the next several years, it is everybody in the school. And I think if there's a takeaway that everybody can leave with this, everybody in the building, everybody is being impacted by stress and trauma right now in these very specific ways. So we pay attention to the cognitive load. We pay attention to how can we lighten the load. As Lindsay was saying, there's very particular things that we can do in order to reserve those very limited resources for the thing that we want folks to be able to do, right? So if we want them to be able to learn math, then what about my math lesson is unnecessary to tax them with? That's where we come into some things that Lindsay was talking about around graphic organizers or planning and calendars. And what we want to do is practically think through your lessons and say, what of this is unnecessarily taxing? And how can I focus on setting up the thing I want them to learn? So some of these things that I have here at the bottom of the slide, when we build conceptual schema, we're talking about like building a whole package of a concept. So if you think about a tree, the schema of a tree has some very particular elements: a trunk, some branches, and some leaves. And that schema can be built on to learn all the different trees. And so whenever we can deliver instruction in a packaged form, in some way that taps into prior knowledge and makes an explicit connection for where that new learning should go in organizing, we've lifted that cognitive stress. The brain doesn't have to do the work of sorting it out. So we can say, this is similar to that. Everybody has seen a such and such, and start thinking about how you can bring that into all of the subjects, can tap into those schemas. Also, reducing redundancy. So this graphic that I have on here is an example of that. If all of these parts of the brain lived in a key off to the side, then it would make this picture much higher of a cognitive stress load, because then my brain has to read somewhere, hold the information, carry it over, label it to the parts, and I've lost so much of the learning. But by labeling it and providing the information directly right here, I have captured and harnessed the power of being able to learn this information in context. So that's where beginning with completed solutions is really powerful. So I wanted to take us through practicing this idea on the next slide. And so this had a bunch of animations, so I'll have to talk you through, but follow with me. So traditionally, these green flashcards are how we learn from flashcards, right? Traditionally, that's how we've understood flashcards. We often talk about we don't want to show the answer, we don't want to give things away, but flashcards, their functionality and their power for learning is actually making something a visual picture memory that can be easily retrieved. And so when you use the blank flashcards that don't have the answer, right? 5 + 5 is blank. And you show that to a child over and over, they sit there and they say, I know it's blank. It's been blank for 50 times now. It's still blank. But when we practice with giving the whole picture, the solutions, 2 + 7 is 9, then the brain gets an imprint of the whole fact, which is the point of what we're trying to get them to learn. We're trying to get them to get that fact preloaded into automatic memory so that it can become part of the schema of those math facts. And then later on in algebra, they don't have to be taxed with the work of trying to figure it out. It's already part of the schema. So in that practice with the solutions, we're reversing the order of how we traditionally have used flashcards to start with the picture of the solution and quiz with the blank. And so one more piece about practicing with the solutions, when we add doing it with a partner and we both say it as we see it, we've just brought in 4 of the 5 senses, which automatically taps into the serotonin and the dopamine because it's fun. You're strengthening the positive connection socially. So you prime the brain for learning this. And then you have also imprinted the memory even stronger. So it accelerates the learning. And then you quiz, once you can get to 3 seconds, you're at automaticity. And so thinking about how do we lift the stuff that is unnecessarily taxing in the face of these limited resources also applies to educators. So in this idea, when we think about an administrator or an instructional coach supporting teachers, give them pre-made flashcards to give to their students. Don't make the teacher make the flashcards. And so just thinking about how we can apply those lifts and lightening the burden to not just our students, but our educators as well, as we're all operating, as Lindsay said, on limited resources. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, Stacy, thank you, and especially for trying to bring us to a positive note of what's possible, even as more and more, if not all of our students start experiencing trauma and uncertainty in the coming months, if not longer. I want to, before I proceed to some questions that I have listed out, I have the YouTube chat loaded up, and we'll try to pay attention to any questions that the audience has. So please send those in. I would love to get those to our panelists. But if I could start on something that has kind of been a thread throughout the 4 presentations, is the neuroplasticity and the ability for the brain to recover. And I think that it is probably especially true at these younger ages, but I mean, the brain is pretty dynamic anyway. I would wonder, can maybe starting with Judy, since this is part of your expertise, and then we can move on to anyone else who wants to chime in. What are some of the ways that we should have hope in students' abilities to bounce back? And what are some of the first things that teachers should be doing either right now in the limited capacity they have on digital and remote instruction? And what should they be doing those first 2 or 3 weeks when schools maybe come back into session?
Okay, I'm holding up fingers to remember the parts of the question, but I want some credit. I remembered, my working memory remembered to unmute. Anyway, thank you for the question and the option. And it really ties into where Stacy was heading and was challenging us, because the brain gets stressed when it's unable to achieve a goal. It gets feedback that it's not doing things right, when things feel hopeless. Well, then as Stacy brought up, there's this dopamine response that is an option instead of the brain just closing down and blocking flow through the amygdala during stress. In addition to things like mindfulness and top-down reflection before acting, there's the building up of that growth mindset, but of the ability, recognizing that you can achieve challenges. Now, why would a brain do that? It's part of survival. Why would anyone go and look for food if you're in a pack of wolves, if your area has no food left? So the brain has this reward system for taking on a challenge and achieving it. And that achievement of a challenge, have you ever felt really good that you achieved a challenge, maybe in sports or an instrument or getting through the day, grading the papers? But the feeling that you get, that intrinsic satisfaction of achieving a challenge, is due to the chemical release of dopamine, which is this reward, satisfaction, and boosts memory, effort, sustained perseverance through setbacks. So the system of providing learners, especially under stress, with ways of increasing the dopamine, feeling value so that they can get through the perceived hopelessness, can come immediately online. I mean, this is just an example. I'm not saying it has to be, but thinking about, you want to reduce their stress, increase the dopamine, flow through the amygdala, the serotonin, that all comes down to how they feel now, but we want to increase their empowerment. We can use a big dopamine response to achieving a challenge to increase their recognition that their effort makes a change. And effort, goal by goal, little by little. That's our job, feedback. But here's an example now. As they are frustrated by the technology online, by not having the emotional connection of face-to-face, by teachers who they've trusted to see sadness in their face or frustration or the need to do something, could read their face to face. As we're all challenged by this, it's an opportunity. It's bringing up emotions. So let learners, parents, and teachers connect with those feelings. I'm angry, I'm frustrated, but applying them to a personally relevant goal. So if you could change something, so switching it, embracing the feelings as part of the survival brain mechanism, and then turning that around. Hey, you may only be in third grade, but who says you can't come up with a better way, whether it's for racial interventions, for justice, or for homework. So empowering them and then providing achievable challenge ways for them to get to their goal. What resources do you need? Oh, it sounds like you need to learn how to multiplication or statistics or recognizing, bringing in content once they're embracing and empowered by the goal that they can make a difference, is my recommendation for early and remote and ongoing.
Great. Stacy, Lori, Lindsay, anyone else want to chime in?
Well, I'd also, I'd really like to share about the power of neuroplasticity with regard to the conditions that we need right now when kids are feeling so overwhelmed. Because absolutely it is about, Judy just did a beautiful job of explaining cognitive neuroplasticity, but creating conditions of safety and being felt, connection, are actually changing the child's brain. You're actually creating almost a portal to the prefrontal cortex. And I think that is, I'm thinking about when we return to school, in Indiana today just released from the Department of Ed guidelines, and it's going to be really difficult. But I think one of the things that we're going to have to think about is being very intentional about creating blocks of time where we are focused, just like we would be for math or language arts or a foreign language. We are all going to have to be very intentional about creating that safe and connected space for our children. And oftentimes it's not going to look academic, it's not going to look cognitive, but what we know is when we are creating those conditions, then we are getting that oxygenated glucose blood flow back up to this cortex.
And Lori, I'm so glad you reminded me of the neuroplasticity. The message is you can change your brain. And teachers and parents, but teachers when kids are coming back, and kids who are coming back after a gap, they had no technology, they had no access for other reasons, they didn't get to move along with their classmates. They need to know, and the teachers need to know that, yes, their brain will not have made some of these neuroplastic bounty of knowledge or connections, but the speed at which they'll catch up can be profound. The duration under which someone can have sustained stress can be years, and still the neuroplasticity of positive experiences, achieving challenges, positive relationships is limitless in the outcome that it can provide. And when kids come back and are tested, and it's important for everyone to know that their initial response based on mastery of a few months of no worksheets is not their ultimate potential. Mm-hmm. Don't judge too soon.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And we had someone on YouTube, Gina, she had a question that kind of connects with something I had been wondering. She mentions we have been telling teachers for several years now to use growth mindset to encourage students to struggle. Are we now asking teachers to remove the struggle, or only in some situations? And that was related to a question I had about, the fact that uncertainty causes stress, but uncertainty is also a reality. And then I was thinking, are we just trying to remove that stress from kids, or are we giving them tools and mechanisms to adapt to that uncertainty and that stress, either now or later on in life? Anyone want to take this growth mindset or uncertainty as reality?
I'll jump in. Oh, sorry, Lindsay, do you want to start? Okay.
No, go ahead.
I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. So, but no, we're not saying take that important struggle away. I think what we're thinking about, or what I'm asking folks to think about, is access, right? How have we ensured, that's our responsibility as adults and educators, that our students can access the learning that is necessary to be successful with the challenge. And so that is going to look different in different ways, right? Access is not just about the technicality or the technical side of things, but it's also about, have I helped this student bridge turning off their stress response and turning on their learning capabilities? With TREP, we talk about survival brain versus learning brain. And so when we maybe have a challenging lesson coming up, then we back up to think about, I know this is really going to stretch my students. How do I set them up for success? Part of that is what both Judy and Lori were talking about, is that we tell them that you can do this. It's going to be challenging. And we shift to a culture of encouraging students to crave a challenge, because challenge is how we grow. And so this is something, when I, years ago in a third grade classroom, I taught third grade for 6 years and had challenge day. And we would make our crazy faces and pump our fists. And I'd start with, okay, today's challenge day. Who wants a challenge? And making challenge exciting and fun and energizing. And so how do we shift and set up those access points and those bridges prior to facing the challenge, so that our students then can face the challenge, meet the challenge, come on the other side with powerful memories of being successful to carry into their next challenge? So Lindsay, what were you about to say?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with all of that. And I guess I would absolutely say we don't want to be stopping challenge, but we want struggle, we want it to be the struggling with the right stuff, the key things, right? The key educational mission, the key social emotional goals, stress coping. We want that kids to be doing the work that's going to be powerful and moving them forward not the work of, managing an assignment or finding the information or, doing work that's kind of irrelevant to really the crucial knowledge. So, I mean, there's a cognitive literature on desirable difficulty, and actually it sort of is very similar to the Vygotskian model of the zone of proximal development. But all of this sort of is that, kids actually, learn best when they're meeting a challenge. Our brains are set up to struggle, right? We're really good at struggling. We get these wonderful sense of accomplishments afterwards. That's how our brain, grows. We, though, want to see some successes. So we want to, set kids' challenges and the struggle to be surmountable, the difficulty to be surmountable, but hard, right? So, this is a challenging context for teachers, right? They're monitoring sometimes 30 plus students in their classroom. They need to be, setting a goal that's just, at the same challenge level for, all the kids in their classroom who are, have many different, levels. And this is always a challenge, something that teachers grapple with all the time. But I think the real key is to think through how to get the sort of mindset around struggle not to be something that's scary, not to be something that, tells you, oh gosh, I'm just not good at this, but rather something that kids are going to persist at. And they can have also the confidence that their teacher has made this safe. They will be able to be successful as long as they do keep persisting. So yes, struggle is good. Keeping in mind, what those goals are to make sure that they are surmountable. And then, and what I kind of wanted to highlight on my slide is to think through the fact that we are talking about brains growing in all kinds of ways. And so things like coping being a very important and meaningful type of struggle that's crucial to the academic mission as well. It's not kind of a side point because it's the same resources that we're dealing with here. And so we're stretching these resources, we're struggling in these ways, and validate that for your students. And you can make that an object of work as well. Thinking about that as being, part of the puzzle, but taking out as much as you can those kind of irrelevant sources of difficulty.
I think what you just also connected us all then, back to the neuroscience and plus, but that dopamine, the feeling I've achieved something that we get when we feel intrinsic satisfaction, it's our job to provide various choices and pathways so our learners, first of all, know that we know they can achieve the mastery. We're there to help, but giving them choices in how they get there with frequent ongoing feedback that they're making progress toward the goal. So whether it's using different levels of books, they can start at level 3 or level 1 or level 1 or 3 video, but they're choosing, and they know that you expect and believe that you're lowering the barriers, but not the bar, and they will achieve it, but give them different ways to achieve it and to demonstrate their mastery. That's the dopamine helping them be their best and build the mindset that they can take on challenge.
Thank you for helping answer my and Gina's question. I also want to ask about just the past couple weeks. I have the pleasure of interviewing students for my job, and believe they're much more eloquent and resilient and empowered than some people may think, whether they're out on the front lines of a public rally, or if they're at home planning a social change project. I think they have a lot of power in their hands. It's having the right adults in their lives to help them amplify it and find the tools and schemes to take advantage of it. But we know right now, whether it's the digital divide and maybe not having a device at home to connect with a teacher, maybe they don't feel comfortable raising their hand on Zoom saying, I'm having a moment right now with everything happening over the past couple of weeks. How do I get through this? Or there's the mismatch between what we know the teaching workforce looks like versus the students they serve. There are many barriers for that sense of belonging for a student to feel like they have a partner in a classroom to maybe bounce off of that and to process this current moment. I wonder, given these existing barriers and new ones by this technological divide, what would be some of the best ways you would tell teachers or even parents who might be listening, this is what your students, your kids might need right now with so much on social media, on TV, and maybe outside their window? Take yours.
Well, let's give teachers, let's take this moment when parents are challenged and flip it to an opportunity. Yes, it's really hard to corral your kids or cats to a learning situation without the dopamine boosters of things like movement, face-to-face, and friends, and interactions, and frequently predictable things. So in that moment of discomfort, as for kids and building their skills, parents have an opportunity to recognize the skills that teachers have as professionals when they can do this in a large class. So recognizing take the moment to recognize, and then realize that teachers are managing with face-to-face and emotional responses. Parents need to read their kids.
I would also like to add to, I think that many of our kids are pretty much on their own too. And I think about there's not the parental, stability that's there, that's guiding them. And so, when we look back on mid-March to, just in Indiana, we were out of school. I know New Jersey is still in school, but everybody's roles collided. Teachers were parenting were, and we were all just trying to figure it out. And so one of the things that I think is going to be really important as we re-enter this time is really preparing ahead of time and including our students in that preparation, giving them a sense of purpose in the planning. So what are our three options? I need you. I need you to help me. So sitting, whether I'm, meeting my new students as the teacher, whether I'm, struggling as a parent, asking for our students to help us, to sit beside with us, and then looking at all the options with them, not for them, but with them. It's kind of like, these new classroom roles and responsibilities that we've been talking about all day today that build connection. Who is going to be noticing, who's your noticer in the classroom, who's going to be keeping track of kindness, who's the kindness keeper, who's your storyteller, who's your resource manager, who's going to be the YouTube ambassador, giving kids a real sense of purpose so that they're part of the planning. I think that's going to be extremely important. We've been talking a lot about that as districts, go back. We need their input. We need our students to sit beside us to plan how this is going to look.
Neil, I want to go back to a point that you raised of also how do we communicate to students that sense of belonging when oftentimes in many situations our teaching staff, the adults in the building, may not look like or come from the same backgrounds as our students. So to turn our attention to that. So I'm also a parent of two children who I credit for my commitment to education because I was in family and youth outreach programs before changing careers. And it was when my son was 3 and I had a part-time position as a summer school teacher of a classroom of 20 young first graders who were essentially on schedule to be retained first grade. And I saw my son. I had 17 girls I had 3 girls and 17 boys of color. So by first grade, 6 and 7 years old, their educational trajectory was already stated or slated for them to be detrimental, right? And so on my lunch hour, I actually called my husband and said, I have to change careers because this is our son. This is the trajectory that he will be on, because this is just a room full of wiggly kids who need to move. And some at that time, Judy had mentioned, you know, kids sitting in rows and needing to sit for so long, and so much of the play and social aspect of learning had been stripped away. And when I was able to bring that play back in, we made tremendous growth. But kids need to move, they need to play, they need to talk, they need to process. They need to know that we see them and we hear them, even in situations. And so I brought that up because I followed my students through. And I mean, my children through as students. I've been able to teach them. They've both been in my class at different times. I was their middle school dean and they still like me. They're both college students now. So that was kind of miraculous. But in the course of that, what I have so appreciated is the connections they've made with teachers who have been the other positive adults that I could call on, even though they might not have looked like our Black family and didn't have the same backgrounds. I knew that they were for my kids. And even today, those are some of those allies that I turn to when, you know, young people don't always want to share with their parents, especially when you're their dean. But I can turn to their teacher and say, hey, can you check in with them? Can you see how they're doing? So on that point, a practical idea that I've shared with several schools, in the return to school, send a traditional postcard. We used to do that. I haven't been in the classroom for a long time, but I used to send a postcard in the mail. And then I would say for administrators, when you give your class roster to your teachers, give them a pre-stamped postcard. And then for the students, have it self-addressed so they can easily return it to you. That's how we lift the burden, but we promote that connection and have them say, who are you? What have you experienced? What are you seeing? I care, I want to hear, I want to listen, I see you. And that can bridge those divides in a really powerful way.
Thank you for that. Yeah, my cousins all attended school with their mother throughout the 12 years, and they have an amazing relationship because of that experience. I can imagine you two as well. One maybe final question before we wrap up. I don't want to close without recognizing how difficult this is all for teachers as well. You know, trying to, you know, I can't imagine how many teachers went into the job thinking I'm going to do this all over Zoom or Google Hangouts or sending learning packets. But they also have their own stresses at home. And I wonder, I believe, Lindsay, you spoke about this a little bit. Lori, you talked about the importance of calm teachers. What are ways that the adults in these lives of children what tips, if any differently, can they use to manage their own stress to help these young people? And then maybe to take it even larger, how can the administrators on this call or on this session help those teachers do their job and focus on the kids?
I'm going to add to that prompt because the answers are anything we can come up with will be great. But my evaluation was, having done neurosurgery little, but teaching isn't brain surgery. It's harder. Because every minute with the students, eye contact, recognizing how they're feeling, how the new introduction of a subject changed them, what happened at lunch, what happened with their friends, knowing how stress impacts their brain, seeing their faces, and even worse, not seeing them digitally, is profoundly more challenging than neurosurgery, where honestly, you have to go to school a lot, but it's cutting and sewing one brain, one region, one thread, one needle. When you have 10, 20, 30, 100 kids in the classroom, it's so hard to know what you want to connect with, and you can't do it. So teaching is harder than brain surgery. How can we help them?
Mm-hmm. So Judy, I love that saying. And so we know right now, as you just said, Neil, that our educators are experiencing all of this. I mean, this has been the theme today at this conference and all the sessions, and I'm so grateful for that. We've all been very attentive and attuned to educator well-being. And so the work that we're doing with applied educational neuroscience is we're really focusing on administrators. And we are we're really looking at, schools and districts as your classroom. And when the leadership of a district or school is on board, and when they are very intentional about connecting with staff, when they're intentional about creating spaces in their buildings for staff to regulate and to feel felt, all of these practices and strategies that integrate these lower regions of the brain that get us to the point where we can think, where we can teach, where we can lead, begin with our staff, and they begin with our administrators. And it's I'm smiling because we've lot of schools that we're working with are creating amygdala areas for staff in buildings, and we're using the language of science. And these aren't just to go in when you feel like it. I mean, you can, but we're being very intentional about sharing the space and using co-regulation with one another. And I also want to say too, our children and our students have a beautiful ability to help us co-regulate. And it's not always the adult doing to the child, or I think in this time, again, embracing this very fragile, vulnerable, complex brain of our children and helping them to be in a place of serving is one of the most healing things that we can provide. So it's a theme I've heard all day, and I'm very, very grateful we're at that point, that I've heard so many practices and strategies with regard to educator well-being, because it starts with us. Again, just like behavior management, it begins with me. It does not begin with the student.
Yeah, and I wanted to add on, I agree. I want to draw attention to the fact that, our teachers of color are particularly going to be sort of burdened and stressed in this context. One of the panelists earlier this morning was giving data from New Orleans, for example, showing teachers of color. I think she was looking particularly at maybe Black teachers, particularly more likely to have, sort of a higher number of big stressors in their lives. And so one of the other things I would urge administrators to be wary of, or attentive to anyway, is that, in developing strategies for supporting our students of color, we tend to draw on our teachers of color to, help us make sure that what we're doing is sensitive, that is responding to needs, and sort of really thoughtful. But these teachers are working really hard already, right? And should really either be compensated and supported, provided extra support, or not be asked to do kind of always the work, though their voices I absolutely should be heard. So just trying to encourage sort of thoughtful support for all of our teachers. All of our teachers are working really hard and are going to be overburdened and will need support. Having students who face trauma, it's going to be impacting the teachers in corresponding ways. But maybe, we also want to be really attentive to our teachers and their needs.
I think along those lines too is something I heard in a previous session. There aren't tier 2 kids. There are students who receive tier 2 services. And I would add to that, at different times. And that same applies to the needs for educators. Educators are going to have a wide variance of the stressors and the loads that they're carrying. And I've been in some conversations where Some educators of Asian descent are fearful of how to handle what students, especially students who are being exposed to some toxic ideas or some rhetoric or repeating things, how do they respond to some of the things that are in the environment that was around COVID-19? We already witnessed just before we went online with school that the bullying against students of Asian descent had already increased. So that's a reality. We also are talking about COVID-19 impacting Black and Brown communities at disproportionate rates. And because of that, oftentimes many Black and Brown educators are also supporting extended families. They might be caring for vulnerable family members as well. So when we're talking about returning to school and the risk increasing, thinking about who is most vulnerable, who is at greatest risk, and then thinking about tiered supports and resources for educators as well as students. So what are we doing for the mental health needs? What are we doing for the risks that we're asking everyone to take on? What does that look like? To think very intentionally, carefully, and thoughtfully through the justice of what we're going to be asking people to do is really important as well. On that one note, I would add to what both Lori and Lindsay were saying, I've seen some tremendous practices coming out of schools where administrators are just holding sessions for teachers to not have to do anything but be real with where they are and what they're feeling. Having things like advisory meetings or just community building meetings for the educational staff, for the folks in the building, for the adults, before we're asking them to do that for students, have been really practical, important ways to say to adults, I see you, I hear you, I see what you're coping with.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Stacy, Lori, and Lindsay and Judy for your time. I think educators in general, before this pandemic maybe didn't get the most attention or respect or recognition. I think individual families and parents understood the importance of their schools, but in one of the recent stories I wrote, someone expressed a lot of hope that the wider public is starting to understand just the clearinghouse of services and need and human connections that schools provide, oftentimes through that one teacher who makes a difference in the lives of a student, but also entire communities beyond that one individual. Hopefully this session gave the people on the front lines of education, whether it's in a digital setting or in class this fall, some tools to better help the children they come in contact with. Thanks for your expertise and work, all the panelists that you do on behalf of students and educators and families. Thank you so much. And the recording of this will be online later, and participants will get copies of the briefs sometime soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Tech Project.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
I feel better.
I do too. Thank you, Judy. Thank you.